Indiana's transportation infrastructure gets a C- from the American Society of Civil Engineers, but you don't have to be an engineer to recognize that some of the state's roads and bridges have become a real pain in the asphalt. Most everyone agrees that repairs are badly needed. What's up for debate is how to pay for the necessary improvements. Hi, I'm Jon Schwantes, and on this edition of Indiana Lawmakers, we'll focus on Indiana's aging infrastructure and what to do about it with a panel of transportation policymakers and stakeholders. First up, though, paving the way for the discussion is this report from Christopher Ayers of WFYI Public Media.
The condition of Indiana's roads and bridges took center stage last summer after the support pier of an Interstate 65 bridge north of Lafayette was found to have sunk 9 inches. That discovery led to a more than month-long closure of a 37-mile stretch of heavily trafficked highway and prompted questions about what the General Assembly might do this session to craft a long-term infrastructure funding solution. Governor Pence broached the issue first when he announced his own road funding proposal in October. It would spend $1 billion on road and bridge improvements over the next 4 years. The plan would be paid for in part by pulling from the state's excess reserves. It'd also require borrowing about a quarter of the proposed funding through a $240 million bond issue. The plan has been taken up in the Senate. House Republicans, however, have proposed a competing roads plan. It would increase the state gasoline tax, which hasn't been raised in over a decade, as well as the cigarette tax. House Speaker Brian Bosma has called the plan, quote, responsible, comprehensive, and sustainable, and he says it would fund the state's infrastructure beyond the 4 years proposed by the governor. It's unclear, though, whether the governor could stomach a tax increase to pay for road funding, something he mentioned earlier this year during his State of the State address.
I think when you got money in the bank and you got the best credit rating in America, the last place you should look to pay for roads and bridges is the wallets and the pocketbooks of hard-working Hoosiers. Let's invest in our roads, let's maintain the Crossroads of America, and let's do it without raising taxes.
It's unclear at this point which plan, if either, will make it to the governor's desk, and whether or not he'd sign it once it got there. But with both plans poised to make it out of committee, it is clear the debate over infrastructure funding has only just begun. For Indiana Lawmakers, I'm Christopher Ayers.
Thanks, Christopher. Back in a moment with our weekly roundtable. Indiana Lawmakers, from the State House to your house.
Purdue researcher Phil Owens is creating new ways to map soil functions, improve plant growth, and increase crop yields, leading through innovation and job creation. Purdue Research Foundation. Contact innovation at prf.org.
In a way, lawmakers began the 2016 session at the political equivalent of a crowded all-way stop. Everyone was in the same place, more or less, because of the near universal recognition that something had to be done about the state's aging roads and bridges. From there, however, lawmakers have accelerated in multiple directions in regard to funding the necessary improvements. Some are steering toward borrowing the money, some are on the road to raising taxes, and others are heading straight toward tapping the state's budget reserves. Think you need a GPS to keep track of it all? Nah, we've got something far better. The expert panel that joins me today. Republican Representative Ed Soliday of Valparaiso, chairman of the House Roads and Transportation Committee. Democratic Representative Dan Forestal of Indianapolis, the ranking minority member of that same panel. Fisher's Mayor Scott Fadness, chairman of the Indiana Association of Cities and Towns Legislative Committee. And Justin Stevens, State Director of Americans for Prosperity, a conservative anti-tax advocacy group founded by billionaire brothers David and Charles Koch. And I thank you all for traveling the roadways to get here for this taping. Ed Soliday, what is the condition of Indiana's roads, do you think? This may sound flippant, but what's more dangerous, political potholes or the actual potholes?
I would rather deal with political potholes than road potholes. You know, we began 5 years ago to ask that question, and quite frankly, in 2013, we passed a bill that told INDOT to hire a consultant and tell us, one, all of the ways to fund roads, and then good, better, and best, using a metric that everyone could understand and that could be used to compare to other states. Out of that study, Indiana was in the lower third of the nation. And looking at a reasoned study in many areas. We are 24th in road miles and well below 30th and sometimes 45th in each of the metrics. So we are the Crossroads of America. We get huge wear on our state highways from 18-wheel trucks and so forth. So we have some work to do.
Now, last year, though, was the budget year, and early on, say last spring, I don't think folks necessarily saw this on the radar.
It has been growing. We began 5 years ago in the committee with a summer study committee. Carl Browning, who was commissioner then last year, testifying before our committee, our joint study committee, before Ways and Means, said that he needed between $250 and $300 million additional dollars every year just to stop the decline in our roads, just to stop the decline. So we knew it was there. The issue was last year there were a lot of other things on the agenda. We wanted to get education taken care of, and the speaker was saying even last year this would be the year of infrastructure.
Well, and Dan Forestal, you and other Democrats have been banging the drum about the condition of the state's roadways for some time, especially since summer when there were the snarls up around West Lafayette with the sinking bridge and the resulting detours. Do you feel that your caucus has helped to bring about the more immediate focus on this issue?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say that. And, you know, look, Democrats really are the reason this issue is probably number one in terms of what the legislature is looking at right now. You know, I think from my perspective, we would have liked to see something be addressed in the budget or in the budget session. Indiana is known for its roads, and right now we are not living up to the responsibility. The roads are just not in great condition. Our infrastructure generally is not in great condition, and it's something that we are, you know, going to have to address. It's good that we all agree on that portion of it. The question is, how do we go forward?
Mayor, how important is road construction and road repairs for mayors in cities big and small?
Sure, I would tell you on Monday, across the board, our number one priority is improvement in transportation infrastructure. And so we're watching Mr. Soliday's bill very closely in the House. We're looking at what's happening in the Senate. And we're talking to all of our representatives about why it's so important to find a sustainable plan for the future of our transportation infrastructure.
And do you think most mayors are saying that they see the problems now, or is this more of a precaution, that the recognition that many of the bridges, many of the roads are in fact aging, and that this will be a challenge in the years to come?
Yeah, we tend not to be alarmist about the issue, but we do think we need to have a thoughtful discussion about the long-term viability of our current funding levels. I know in Fishers, for instance, as mayor, at the current funding level, we would repave our roads once every 72 years, which is not a sustainable model. So our roads might be in decent condition today, but the likelihood that they will be for 10, 15, 20 years under the current funding levels is unlikely. So we do need to have this conversation today.
And Justin Stevens, your organization, you would just as soon not see a lot of governmental intrusion, a lot of big spending, but would you acknowledge that an infrastructure, especially for what's touted as the Crossroads of America, is important for the economic structure here?
I mean, I think anyone would agree with that. We think that providing the appropriate infrastructure is a basic core function of government. And so we do think that should be taken care of. Now, where we may differ is how we do that and what are our priorities. So that is a basic core function of government. What are some of the other things that maybe aren't? And how do we need to prioritize our state budget to reflect that?
The governor did jump into the fray in the fall with a proposal, $1 billion over 4 years, tapping the reserves to a certain extent, and also borrowing or bonding, as I guess it's more pleasant to say. What was wrong with that bill?
Well, first of all,
I shouldn't speak about it in past tense, incidentally. It's still alive and well.
First of all, we're glad he recognizes there's a problem. The second piece of it, the bill in the first year creates about $400 million because we've been overfunding Medicaid for a while. In the second year, it only creates money if there is more revenue than the budget and the reserves are over 11.5%. So if you look at the fiscal delivered by legislative services, they're all zeros, no money. It's unpredictable because if we have a recession of any kind or a dip in the economy, and we fund those basics. When you look at our budget, how lean it's been since Governor Daniels was here and how well managed it's been, 54% of it or so is K through 12 education. Another 11% is higher ed. So you really don't have any money for a growing problem after the first year. Second of all, a number of us do not want to pass the debt for that infrastructure on to our children, so we don't want to bond. Today, out of bonding that was done in 1998, we're paying $100 million a year, and those dedicated sources now don't pay that $100 million, so we're having to dip into our general revenues to pay through 2029 for infrastructure that's coming apart.
So we don't agree. The debt outlasts the repairs that they funded.
It's like buying a home and mortgaging the carpet for 30 years when it lasts 15.
Dan Forestal, your caucus may not like necessarily the borrowing, but I think it's clear that you do like the notion of tapping the reserves.
The governor's plan to put, a portion of our roads on a credit card is just fiscally not responsible. It's not smart public policy. I think we'll be paying it off long after the roads have deteriorated and gone. We'll still be paying the bonds off. In fact, our children will be paying those bonds off. But where we do agree with the governor is that now is not the time to raise taxes on Hoosiers. Indiana has lagged behind in median household income, per capita income, and in terms of the rest of the nation, we are behind. And until those kinds of trends turn, House Democrats feel that what we should do is roll up our sleeves and look in the existing budget and the surplus, the money we've already collected from taxpayers, to fund our infrastructure. Then maybe we move on and talk about some of the other larger issues and maybe some of the really long-term, long-looking things. But before we've checked the couch cushions and really shaken the trees and made sure we've exhausted every other option, we just feel like now is not the right time to raise taxes.
And we are going to talk a lot about taxes. Believe me, that's going to be an important part of this discussion. But I guess, Mayor, you and your colleagues across the state probably also were troubled initially by the notion that the initial legislation that was put forth by the governor dealt only with state-controlled roadways, not those controlled by counties or municipalities, and that's the vast majority of the road miles in the state, is it not?
Well, I think the governor did come out and support Senator Hirschman's bill that would release $430 million back to locals. So I think there is some recognition by the governor and the Senate that there is a need to get money back to the locals to work on this issue.
Just focusing on the state would have been a non-starter for
It would have been difficult for us. Obviously, there are challenges at the local level that we need to deal with, and that $430 million is certainly a significant one-time amount of money to get back to the locals in terms of their local income taxes. So I think there is a recognition by the governor that there is a need at the local level as well. It just wasn't in the initial concept of the bill.
And again, that's giving back the local option income taxes that the state is holding effectively for the locals. What do you think about this?
I just think it's a hard sell. When we talk to Hoosiers and we've made tens of thousands of phone calls and we've knocked on thousands of doors, I think it's a hard sell to tell Hoosiers that we have $2 billion in reserve, that our revenue increased by $750 million last fiscal year alone. $600 million of that was in individual income taxes and sales tax revenue. To then ask them to pay more, I think it's a hard sell. So, they have their work cut out for them as far as selling that to the public, and we're going to keep informing people of our views of that.
Ed Soliday, sell the public on it and sell Justin Stevens on it. Why the tax increases?
Well, I'll never sell Justin.
Come on.
I try not to worry about him too much. This is not new to us. We've been working at it for 5 years. We have a number of polls. I've never seen it like this. Across America, there's infrastructure issues. 65% of Americans and about the same amount of Hoosiers say something has to be done. Up until the last year and a half, only 30% were willing to pay for it in any way. Today, well over 50% of Hoosiers in at least 3 polls have said, we are willing to pay more.
What's the difference? I mean, can you pinpoint one thing?
Sure.
Is it the situation
I think particularly in your area, well, exactly. But on the day I spoke at a conference, we had another bridge in southern Indiana have problems. People were chip and sealing a lot of roads instead of paving them. So we're seeing windshields broken. Right now, today, Hoosiers spend about $366 per year on maintaining their vehicles from damage from roads. So they're feeling it. So I can tell you that every place I have spoken, and I've spoken a lot of places, when I say how many of you are willing to pay a nickel more on your gas, a nickel more per gallon, that's $25 a year, it's about 5% that say no.
Well, you stipulated up front you can't convince Justin Stevens to change his mind. How about yours, Dan Forestal? Does that argument ring true in any way?
Look, I will say this. Representative Soliday has worked very hard on a really thoughtful bill that has a lot of really good provisions. But
you knew that was coming.
That's right. Yeah, the asterisk.
I'm thrilled.
And he did a nice job of really trying to sell it. But look, the corporate income tax is set to decline almost to half of what it is right now over the next couple of years. So, I think I agree with, Justin, and it is rare. I would have to point out that Americans for Prosperity and Democrats agree. It's nice.
He tried to get me to endorse his plan, but it just wasn't.
There's some Koch brothers funding in your campaign report. We're going to know things.
Yeah,
about.
and it's nice to agree on some of these pieces, but for as long as the corporate income tax is set to go to almost half of what it is right now, it's going to be very hard to go back and tell my constituents, but we want to raise your taxes. Corporations have had it very, very well for a very long time, and I like having low taxes for everyone, but having corporations' taxes go down while Hoosiers go up, it's just a non-starter for us.
So, and there are various mechanisms that would increase revenue. Ed Soliday mentioned one, the 4-cent per increase on the gas tax. Also, to offset the decline in Medicaid spending, there'd be a $1 on a pack of cigarettes additional tax. But there's also a lot more latitude for locals, municipalities, and counties to raise additional surcharges. Good idea?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a good idea to give us the tools to make a decision at the local level whether or not we want to increase resources and add that fee or tax at a local level. I think those tools that are given to the cities are imperative for the long-term viability of our communities, and we really applaud the efforts of Soliday in that, trying to get that done.
And you think municipalities have the stomach to do it? I mean, you point out they are the closest to the citizenry and to taxpayers and voters.
Well, I mean, that depends on which city you're talking about and the situation that they're in, but I think there's a value proposition conversation here with the residents that when you can demonstrate the value of what their tax dollars are going to improve their infrastructure, I think a lot of rational Hoosiers would look at that and say, you know what, I do want to see this problem fixed, and I'm willing to pay a little bit more.
Justin, does it matter to you if the taxes are levied at the state level or by the counties or the municipalities, or does it all strike you as a horrible thing?
I think the key is here that this is a little bit misleading when we say just a nickel more per gallon. Because when you go to a city like Jeffersonville down in southern Indiana or New Albany, who currently they do not have a wheel tax, if you have two people in a family that they both own a car, they drive to work 15 miles a day, it could be a $250 to $300 increase, not including if they smoke cigarettes. If the county implements a wheel tax, which would now be a double wheel tax under this bill, and then the city then of 20,000 or more implements another wheel tax on top of that, and then they're paying an extra $25 a piece a year for their gas. It's not an insignificant amount, especially for different populations.
But how does one fund these, if it's $1 billion a year that's needed, or 300 additional million are needed, or 1.5, I've seen lots of numbers. How does that get done?
Well, I think it's all about priorities. I think that's what we've been talking about. For a long time, we've been spending transportation money for general fund projects. This past year, it would have been $350 million a year that was derived from sales tax on gasoline that could have been spent on transportation, but it hasn't been. And I will give, yesterday Representative Brown pointed out that Republicans designated 1% to roads and infrastructure back in the bill that he was talking about earlier, and certainly they deserve credit for that. But that's not enough. We should go the full way.
One other thing I'd like to point out, and I really do, I mean this with all due respect, but in Fishers, people may be a little more able to find the extra income or the extra money to fund this tax. And in my district, we have some really, really hard hit areas. There are some very, very poor areas in my district where it could have a much larger impact than it would in maybe a Fishers or a Crossroads.
Is that an issue? Even with the Hirschman bill, there would be some would say a disproportionate benefit to better heeled communities that have higher income tax levels.
Well, I think, again, when we talk about it's dependent upon each city, I think there's a local democratic process that's available if we were to implement these tools, where residents would have an opportunity to weigh in as to whether they think it's a good idea for their community or not. So I think each community is going to have to weigh that decision and whether it's in the best interest for the residents. So whether it's a Fishers or some other community, I really think it's still going to be up to the residents ultimately when we talk about those local tools that are included in this bill.
Of course. I think, first of all, we need to get some funky math out of here, because we've tried to be data driven. For somebody to pay the kind of money Justin's talking about, they would have to be driving their vehicles 60,000 miles a year. The average Hoosier drives about 11,988 miles, something like that, per car. So when you work that out, he pays, and if you look at average mileage per gallon, or miles per gallon, you're looking at about $108 per vehicle per year that people are paying. That's $108. What's your cell phone bill? Now for the average Hoosier to go to $250, I need to see the math that gets us there.
That's not based on the gas tax alone. I'm saying if a wheel tax were implemented in these communities.
Where they don't have them now, you're saying.
Yeah. So you get a wheel tax of $50 from a city, $50 from a county, that's $100. If you have two cars, that's $200. And then you're paying the additional $50 a year in gas taxes if you're both driving. So that's where the math comes from.
And the people get to decide that. And the true issue, the issue here is, Fishers is unique. It's a fairly new city. Asphalt lasts about 15 to 20 years. Concrete lasts about 30 years. And that means rebuild it all the way to the clay. We have cities, bridges last about 50 years. We have bridges that are on a 188-year rebuild cycle. We have cities that are on 70 and 80-year repave cycles. Now the problem with the Hirschman bill, that's 1 year, one pop. Our cities need about $470 million a year incremental just to stop the decline.
Of course, a one-year pop is good when it's an election year. And what role does that play, the fact that in November many of your colleagues will be standing for re-election?
I'm sure, at some level it makes it more difficult, but I think mostly people are, either philosophically or they have some kind of technical, issue with the bill, some kind of funding mechanism portion of it. I don't think it's all election related. It really comes down to, have we done the really hard work necessary to look for the money in the existing revenue we have, and House Democrats just don't feel like we have.
And we talked about the T-word taxes. The bill also talks about studying, not implementing, but studying tolls. Is that acceptable to your organization?
Well, I think we can study that for the long term. We're open to the study for sure.
So that's better than taxes in your mind?
Well, I think that's a long-term discussion. If we're deciding between raising taxes right now or a long-term solution for transportation funding 20, 30 years down the road, that might be something we have to consider.
All right, Mayor, no tolls on 116th Street, if you would, or else.
This is coming from a guy that drove up 65 this morning that would have had to pay about $16 to get here. So,
well, I appreciate your coming, and I appreciate everyone else being here for this important discussion. Again, my guests have been Republican Representative Ed Soliday of Valparaiso, Democratic Representative Dan Forestal of Indianapolis, Fishers Mayor Scott Fadness of the Indiana Association of Cities and Towns, and Justin Stevens of Americans for Prosperity. We're talking fantasy sports in Indiana, so if you're a DraftKings or a FanDueler, I bet you'll double down on the next Indiana Lawmakers. Time now for our weekly conversation with Ed Feigenbaum, publisher of the newsletter Indiana Legislative Insight. Well, Ed, we got radio spots on one side, we got direct mail pieces on the other side. This is getting heated.
Absolutely, and it's not going to go away real quickly. As much as we might think that everything will be decided quickly, it's not going to be decided in the next few weeks. It's not even all going to be decided this session. I think next year you're going to see a lot more attention to this, regardless of what we do this year, because we're going to look for a short-term fix, which could include taxes this year. But next year will be the real key as we do what Ed Soliday wants to do, just take that long-term view down the road. What's going to be interesting over the next couple of weeks, though, is the fact that the filing deadline closes soon for candidacy. So these legislators, particularly Republicans who fear being primaried, are going to see who their opponents are before they have to vote effectively on a tax increase toward the end of the session. So that's going to help drive this debate.
But you think the tax question could survive even though it's an election year?
Absolutely, and I think what you will see is some type of indexing. The indexing that Representative Soliday was referring to, I think that's almost a certainty.
So there's an ongoing increase in the tax rate
right,
to keep pace with inflation.
We bump things back to where they were before the rates changed. And you know, when you look at where we are today in terms of gas prices versus where we were back then, you know, in 2000 when Governor O'Bannon imposed the temporary ban on the gasoline sales tax, gas at the Shell station at 16th and Capitol in Indianapolis was $1.84.9 a gallon, and today on my way into the studio it was down to $1.74.9. So even if you had indexed today's prices against the prices back then, you know, you'd still be at about the same price as you were back 15, 16 years ago.
If a tax bill shows up on the governor's desk, does that put Mike Pence in a tough spot? He said in the State of the State that the last place he would look for funds would be in the wallets and pocketbooks of Hoosiers.
He's been pretty good about being cooperative and letting the legislature come up with the best set of conclusions and the best packages. And I think that if he gets what he wants in there, he'd be willing to at least allow a tax increase in either cigarettes or the gasoline sales tax to become law, either with or without his signature.
And these are not either or A, B, or C. This could be an amalgam by the time we're all done in conference committee.
It absolutely will be a package here that'll be presented to the governor.
Very interesting. Ed, thank you as always for your insight. For more information, streaming episodes, and extra content, go to wfyi.org/lawmakers. You can also visit us at WFYI on Facebook and Twitter. Use hashtag Indiana Lawmakers. You can access live streaming coverage of the General Assembly on the internet as well. And remember, you can get our show on demand from Xfinity and Bright House Networks. Well, that concludes another edition of Indiana Lawmakers. I'm Jon Schwantes, and on behalf of WFYI Public Media, Indiana's other public broadcasting stations, and my colleagues Ed Feigenbaum and Christopher Ayers, I thank you for joining us, and I invite you to visit WFYI.org for more on the 2016 session. Until next week, take care.
Purdue researchers are finding new ways to treat cancer, provide drug-free therapies, advance wound repairs, reduce chronic illness symptoms, helping people, changing lives. Purdue Research Foundation. Contact innovation at prf.org.